continuing our study of those 52 stories, which are a foundation for our faith and our practice. We've come to the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. It not only emphasizes God's power to do the impossible, but that God knows what we need even before we ask, but we come asking, and He desires that of us. And it also reminds us that God's timing and taking care of our need is always perfect. But the primary lesson that we are to learn from this, according to John, is about Jesus' identity, a lesson that we know well. John's hope in sharing this story is that we come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of God. He is the one who came into the world to save us. Just as because Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead does not mean that He has promised to raise everyone we love from the dead in that same sort of way. If you think that is what God is promising through this story, then you're going to be disappointed. You're going to have times where you see someone who is close to death, and you pray for them to be relieved and restored, and it doesn't happen. There'll be times when even after they're dead, you're like, man, can you just give them back? Yes, Jesus has the power to raise people from the dead, but He doesn't use it that way, at least not all the time. And He certainly doesn't use it that way when we're the ones who are trying to command Him. As for Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, he would later die again. He would have to suffer the pain of death twice. And after that second death, he was not called forth from the grave, but he held on to the promise of life that all of us share in Jesus. Jesus has promised to use His power to do what had to be done so that we could trust Him, so that when we stand before God on the day of judgment, we can be assured that our sins have been forgiven and we'll pass through that judgment into the promise of heaven. And I think that's why we resonate with the part of this story with how Mary responded to Jesus when He told her that Lazarus would rise again. Jesus actually tells Martha, yeah, your brother Lazarus, he's going to rise again. And Martha says, well, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And that's the resurrection that we have hope of. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? What a question to ask Martha, whose brother is in the tomb. She says, yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even He who comes into the world. She makes a statement that sounds a lot like the Great Confession, doesn't it? Sounds like the very same thing that Peter said. Sounds like the confession that we make. John believed, and he wants us to believe, that Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead was a sign, an unmistakable, observable indication that Jesus is God's one and only Son, whom He did send to save the world, of whom we have been a part in the past. But now, because of His grace, we no longer are. This desire that we believe is evident in how John included what Jesus said when he received the message that Lazarus was only sick. John records that Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified in it. Glory, as I've defined before in some of these sermons as we've gone along, is a word that meant to make you think rather than one that means to shine, which is usually what we think of when we hear the term glory because of its English use. An event that brings glory to someone is one that makes us think about them perhaps in a new way. That's why when God does something in our lives, we want Him to receive the glory about it. We want people to think about Him and change their thinking about Him and recognize who He is and what He can do. we want people to put their hope in him, a hope that leads that thinking to believing. If you were reading through the Gospel of John, and I encourage you to do that someday if you haven't, or if you haven't done it recently, to do it again. If you're reading from the beginning through the end, and you came to this story about Lazarus, this would be the very first time you would have heard his name. But you would already have been introduced to his sisters, Mary and Martha. Mary was the sinner who anointed Jesus with her tears and some rather expensive perfume, and then dried his feet with her hair whenever he had gone to share a meal in a Pharisee's home. He'd been invited into that home. And whenever Mary did this to him, it made the Pharisee question whether Jesus was really the Messiah or not. Because if he was really the Messiah, he should have known what sort of woman Mary was. And he should have kept his distance from her. But that's because the Pharisee didn't understand what the Messiah was all about. Just before that invitation to the dinner, Jesus had said, this generation, which included the Pharisees as well, were like a bunch of children looking for entertainment. You know how that is when you're just looking to be entertained, looking for that value of it. He says, whenever the flute was played, they didn't dance. And whenever the dirge was sung, they didn't cry. Jesus alludes that he was the flute being played, which they couldn't hear and understand the music, and so they didn't dance. And John the Baptist was the dirge, the one who brought the bad news, and they didn't weep. They couldn't hear the message of the flute and the dirge because their hearts weren't touched by it. They weren't in tune to it. They didn't believe it. You would also have been introduced to Mary's sister, Martha. She opened her home to Jesus and his disciples as they passed through her town, which was in Bethany, just a couple of miles on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And whenever Jesus and his disciples came through, as they would come to visit feasts, they would stop and she would host them in her house. Jesus and his disciples and whoever else was traveling with them. If you think it's hard to feed a few people, man, you don't know when they're showing up, but the feast is coming. You know they're going to be there, so you're getting everything ready for when they do arrive. And when they arrive, there's all those last-minute things you have to do. And you get introduced to Mary being upset. You know, Jesus comes and Mary sees it, and she leaves what she's doing. Martha says, Mary, you need to come in here and help me. And Mary's like, no, I need to listen to Jesus. And Martha is upset about it. So we hear about these two ladies, this Mary and this Martha. Mary, the one who gets transformed. Martha, the one who's trying to serve Jesus in some practical way and upset the sister won't help her. There's evidently more to the story that isn't recorded in the Gospels between Jesus and these three siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Because John tells us at the very beginning of this story that Jesus loves them. He loves them all the same. This story begins with the news that Lazarus, whom Jesus loved, just like he loved Mary and he loved Martha, it just says very sick. We don't know what the sickness was, but he was very sick. And while we're not told what Mary and Martha had done to try to take care of him, I can't imagine that they would have done nothing. They would probably have done everything they could to make him better. They probably would have contacted every source, every doctor, prayed every prayer. But Lazarus doesn't respond to their care. Like so many people in their day who had no hope of a loved one getting better, they send word to Jesus. Surely of all the people that Jesus knows, someone who's intimate with them, he would come to help. They knew that Jesus could heal. They probably had seen the evidence of it that we long to see. But the feast that Jesus had come story was over. He'd already passed through. He's gone, headed back to Galilee. He's not near Judea anymore. As I mentioned, when word finally catches up to Jesus, he says this sickness isn't going to end in death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified in it. We are not told what the disciples made of Jesus' declaration. But that is whenever John mentions Jesus' love for Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He knows what they need. He loves them. He's prepared to meet their need. But in the same breath, we're told that Jesus intentionally stays 2 days longer just where he's at. He doesn't pack up things and rush off. He doesn't say, oh gosh, this is an emergency. I've got to go there right now. We don't mind Jesus' delay because we know the rest of the story. But Mary and Martha don't. They didn't know what was going to happen next. They just knew their brother was sick, and Jesus is the one who can take care of it, and he's a long ways away. So they're acting differently as they watch their brother go from sickness into death, and Jesus not showing up. When Jesus told his disciples that, okay, now it's time to head back to Judea, they object. They say, hey, Jesus, don't you remember that the Jewish leaders tried to stone you when we were at the feast just a while ago? I mean, surely you haven't gotten into short-term memory loss yet. I mean, we were just there. They really tried to do this to you. And so, Jesus, we know that it's just not a good idea. We barely escaped with our lives. Jesus responds to their objection with a question. He says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Sounds like a puzzle, a mystery. But Jesus says this to his disciples because he wants them to understand that they are not to be afraid of returning with him to Judea. His time had not yet come. But even whenever they finally realize that Jesus isn't messing around, he's really going to go, they go like, well, I guess let's go with him. We'll die with him if we have to. They didn't get what Jesus was trying to tell them. We are not to be afraid whenever we walk in the day. It was at this moment in the story that Jesus told his disciples the real reason they needed to head back, that it was because their friend Lazarus had fallen asleep and he needed someone to wake them up. Well, because they weren't convinced that going back was a good idea, they argued that, well, Jesus, if Lazarus is just asleep, he's got to wake up. We don't need to go back to wake him up. He's just napping. And so Jesus has to make very plain to them the real reason. The truth. Hey guys, Lazarus is dead. You can just almost hear their thoughts. They'll bury him. We don't have to go back, Jesus. He tells them that he was glad that they had not been there, so that they, his disciples, would believe. You heard that right when you read the scriptures together. As much as the disciples understood and believed up to that point, they still had some lessons to learn about who Jesus was and what his identity is and what they need to be believing about him. So I want you to read what happens next from John 11:17 through 22 with me. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. What faith Martha has in Jesus. She did not believe that he would do whatever she desired, but she did believe that God would give him anything for which he asked. Her implication is clear, though. She really was hoping that Jesus was asked to bring her brother back to life. And if Jesus asked it, it would happen. That's a strong faith. When we suffer loss, grief hits us. When we want what was lost, we want it returned. That's part of grief. When we hear the initial that you've lost something important, we want it restored. We want to be made whole again. We want things to go back the way they were before the loss, as if that loss never really happened. And losses enter into our lives in so many ways. It could be a romantic relationship that ends, or a marriage, or a cherished friendship that gets broken. It could be a puppy that you have to put down. It could be empty arms and a broken heart due to an abortion that you were told was really okay, or miscarriage, or an infertility or an abuse. The news that a loved one is diagnosed with cancer, or that someone you love has died. The dreams of what would be, what we were hoping to experience in the future with that person, is dashed in a moment. I know this to be true, as many of you do, because we've all suffered this kind of loss. It's that phone call that comes in the middle of the night, and we hear the words, and our lives are changed forever because those things we were hoping for aren't going to happen. Susan Mead, the mother of two successful young men, experienced that kind of loss when her phone rang in the middle of the night. Her son, Matthew, was just wailing on the other end of it. She couldn't understand what he was saying, and finally the first word she could understand was, "Kyle died last night." Kyle. Her other son, her younger son. And all she could think of was, God, no. This can't be true. She was told at the funeral for her son that she was to celebrate his life and to be happy that he was now in heaven. She wasn't happy. She was sad. And she felt that if she were to show any sign of being sad, it would be interpreted by those who were around her that she just didn't believe enough. That she just didn't really believe in the hope of heaven. And that's why she wasn't sad. She believed all right, but her heart was broken. Every update from Kyle's friends about milestones in their lives just ripped her heart apart. Graduation announcements came in. She was happy for them, but all she could think about is, my son Kyle didn't make it that far. I'm not going to be going to his graduation. Birth announcements came in as they would progress in their life, and she was happy for them, but she was reminded by them that there'd be no grandchildren from her coming, running to embrace her, holding out those pudgy hands. There'd be no tossing them into the air or squeals of laughter. It seemed that every aspect of life reminded her of all that she had lost when her son died. She felt like she had to put on a happy face all the time, and she had to hide her weeping and her groaning and her anguish, her bitterness. At one of the lowest moments, when she was struggling with her depression and overwhelmed, that's when it finally happened. She finally gave herself permission to truly grieve, to acknowledge what she had lost, and that her future really was going to be different, and it was okay for her to be sad about that. She had to let go of those dreams that were never going to be fulfilled, and all of the hopes that were attached to it. She finally came to understand that it was okay to lament. Man, And a lot of the Psalms, when you read through the book of Psalms, are laments. Cries to God over things that were lost. There is a time to cry, but not as the world does. And she finally began to understand that. We are not to grieve as those who have no hope, but we are to grieve. The world may believe that life ends at the grave. We put our hope in the Lord, and the Lord who is the life, the resurrection. It's okay yet to grieve. Our God knows what it's like to lose a son, and that son knows what it's like to lose a friend. Even in the knowledge of the resurrection, even in Jesus knowing that this sickness wasn't going to end in death, they grieved the loss. Tears were shed. This is where that one memory verse comes along, right? That we all say, oh, I got a memory verse, Jesus wept. And we say it so flippantly. Jesus wept. His tears were real because his heart was broken because of the loss. It's okay for us to grieve, to suffer, whenever we know we've lost something like that. God's love, his power and promise to raise the dead brings light into the darkness of our depression and grief. And it is by that light that we can find our footing and take the next step of living the life that God has set before us without that which we have lost. We can grow through our grief rather than being devastated by it. So let's go back to our story. Chapter 11, verse 28. When she, this being Martha, had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and he's calling you." And when she said it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him. Interesting. She'd been there before. She falls at his feet with tears again, just not the perfume. And she says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. He's grieving. And he says, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And that's when we get that famous verse. Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how much he loved him." Now, whenever it says that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, it was the word agape. But here they're watching him grieve, and they say, "See how he phileo him." See how he had this brotherly love, this intimate love, this deep, abiding love. But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man also from dying?" So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave when a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, in case you missed that in this story, says to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for it has been 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it so that they may believe." Interesting. That they may believe that you sent me. That's what this is all about. This miracle is a miracle with purpose. It's not just an act of compassion to comfort Mary and Martha or even himself. It is a sign for all those who had gathered to comfort Mary and Martha in their loss, that they might come to put their hope in Jesus too. So let's read on, verses 43 through 46. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. How could you not? They believed in Jesus. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. I'm going to ask our music team to start making their way forward. It had been prophesied that the Messiah, the Christ, would rise from the dead. And Jesus had raised the dead on many occasions. This only being a very public occasion, an undeniable event, a sign. In fact, when the Pharisees heard about it, when they did, the rest of the story is they're like, we've got to keep this news from traveling around. So not only did they want to kill Jesus, they started plotting to kill Lazarus. They didn't want this proof of Jesus being the Son of God walking around in testimony. There continues to be those who want to suppress the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. They'll tell you that it's just a story. It's just a fairy tale. They'll say that you can't really trust John's gospel. It's so old and out of date, and it's just that's not really true. They'll say anything they can to convince you to disregard this truth, this story. Why? Because it is a sign that Jesus is who he claims to be. He is God's one and only Son who has come to save us from our sin, to offer us forgiveness. And if this story really is true, then Jesus' identity really is affirmed. And they don't want that. They don't want to have to say that Jesus is the Lord. They don't want him as their Lord. They don't want him as their Savior. They think that they're good enough without it. But that's the sad part of the story. They believed the lie. The truth is that none of us are good without it. We need our sins forgiven so that we can have the promise of heaven. And that's what Jesus has come for. And I hope that that's what you believe when you hear a story that Jesus has risen Lazarus from the dead. Because that promise is for you too, because of what he's done. We're going to be having a hymn of invitation, a time of decision in whatever your next step is in following Jesus, whether it's making him Lord of your life or trying to figure out how to follow him in the season that you're walking through. Would you please stand?